Cool, thank you, and thanks for asking me to do this. I'm clearly not a China specialist, as was clear from what Pete said. There's sort of two reasons why I think it makes sense for me to do this. One is, before coming to Manchester, I was a professor at the University of Ottawa, so Pascale and I were colleagues there. Not for very long, partly because you came about 2 years before I came back to move to Manchester, and then after a year you then got hived off into government to go and work for Justin Trudeau. So on China's strategy, on the China strategy within the Canadian government. So, but anyway, it's really nice to have that circularity, have an old colleague from where I used to work. The other is that loads and loads of the stuff in this book, which I can't claim to have read every page, but I have read a fair bit, is really central to the stuff that I am interested in, which is the global response to climate change. So understanding China's role in structuring all these key markets in metals and minerals is actually really, really important to the climate challenge. So that's a sort of way in for me, and I will make a couple of, the questions are going to be out in the book, but that's sort of in the back of my mind. The picture on the cover is a fantastic, is a picture by Edward Ботинski, who's a very well-known Canadian photographer who specialises on these absolutely colossal scale photographs of extraordinarily destructive practices. This is from a thing called Manufactured Landscapes.
Particular pictures from
Oh right, but that was one of them was called Manufactured Landscapes, which was about China and industrialisation, and then he did one in the Alberta tar sands in Western Canada called Beautiful Destruction. But anyway, it's a fabulous image. So that'll do for starters. As you will see, for the first question, the book is called China's Vulnerability Paradox, which is a very particular phrase. So I wonder if we can start by you sort of unpacking what do you mean by China's vulnerability paradox and why is it the organising device for the book?
Thank you. And first of all, thank you so much for inviting me here. I'm very happy to be in Manchester. I'm even sporting the B, if you will have noticed. So China's vulnerability paradox, why is it in the book title? I think the most commonly deployed frame to speak about China in various areas of political economy, but nowadays clearly in the area of minerals and critical minerals is the concept of Chinese power or Chinese dominance, right? But in the commodities that I study in the book, what struck me through the various interviews that I conducted and through looking at numbers is that China was also displaying various forms of vulnerabilities in those markets. And this is for various reasons. First of all, in all the commodities I study in the book, China is massively import dependent. So again, we're used, especially today, to think about China as dominating in those sectors, but that's mainly in the sort of refining and processing stages. But actually in the consumption of raw commodities, China remains heavily import dependent. And the four commodities I study in the book, iron ore, potash, uranium, and copper, China is very dramatically import dependent, close to 50% and up in all those markets. So that's one way in which vulnerability shows up. But there's a further couple of ways in which it does. And one of the core concepts that I employ in the book is the concept of market power and market vulnerability. And there, what I mean by that is that China has displayed market power vulnerabilities in certain markets, and this has influenced very much the way in which it has behaved in those markets. And I'll give you an example. So in the iron ore market, for example, China is facing a very concentrated global market. So heavily concentrated geographically, but also among companies, right? 3 or 4 huge companies control the export market. But the Chinese importers are extremely fragmented. the Chinese domestic iron ore industry is extremely fragmented. And this is what I look at in the book, is the market power differential and asymmetry, which I call market power vulnerability, which I think has a huge impact on how China behaves in this market. So vulnerability kept showing up. The way my interviewees spoke about their positionality in the markets also made reference to the concept of weakness and incapacity to fully control the outcomes of China's interactions. So vulnerability kept showing up, and so I decided to make it a key concept in the book.
Cool, great. So you mentioned the sort of 4 core commodities that you treat in the book, and iron ore and potash each get a chapter, and then you've got a chapter combining uranium and copper. Can you give us a sense of why you focused on those 4 and what between them they tell, what variation, what differences there are across them and stuff?
Yeah, so the original impetus for me to pick iron ore and potash goes back to an op-ed actually in the Financial Times in 2010, in the spring of 2010. And at the moment, I was not really specifically looking at commodities, but I was looking at China's impact on the global economy more, broadly. And I was looking for a case, an empirical case, where we could see an institution, a global economic institution, transformed by China. And, I was looking broadly. And I remember at the time, 𝗶𝗳𝗄𝗃𝗲𝗄𝗃, a very well-known commodities reporter for the Financial Times at the time, wrote a piece about the fall of the iron ore benchmark pricing regime. And I didn't know at the time what that was, but it struck me as something that was very interesting. And as I delved into it, I figured this would become an anchor, an empirical anchor in my project at the time. And what I was then looking for was whether this was something that was unique. So China emerging essentially as a really major consumer of a key commodity, and leading, so it seemed at the time, to the fall of a 4 decades long economic institution. Was this something that would be representative of more to come? Was this a unique event? How could I make sense of this? So I went out looking for commodities that I could compare the iron ore case to. And as a good comparativist, deploying, Mill's method of difference, I was looking for markets that displayed some, structural similarities to the iron ore market that I could then compare China's impact on. And potash emerged as one really interesting comparison to the iron ore market, because structurally speaking, internationally, they're markets that very much look like one another, and both had benchmark pricing systems in place at the time of China's emergence. So just as a primer, a benchmark pricing system is basically a pricing institution where consumers and producers meet and get an agreement on a price for the coming period of time. That was the case for the iron ore market. Before China's emergence, the key Japanese consumers and the key iron ore exporters used to meet once a year, agree on a price, and the price would stay valid for the year. In the potash market, it was very much a similar structure. And so I decided to compare those 2 markets. Those 2 markets form the main comparison of the book, and the main puzzle of the book, because in one case, in the iron ore case, China's emergence led to the fall of the benchmarking system and the emergence of a spot market. And in the potash case, the benchmarking system survives to this day. So what I had there is 2 very similar markets, 2 cases of China rising to be the main consumer, displacing, taking the place of the main negotiator in the benchmark negotiations, and then one market falling apart, one pricing regime falling apart, and the other didn't. So that's the original puzzle of the book, what explains this variation. This explains the initial case selection. And then as I started to, this is a very inductive exercise, as I started to understand better what was happening and what explained this divergence, I added 2 more cases to add a little bit of variation on the international level. So I added uranium and then copper to provide a little bit more variation there. But the original comparison is iron ore and potash for that reason, yeah.
Cool. Thank you. And that you use the term, we use 2 terms actually, I think, around that, especially around the iron ore case. One is the notion of unintended consequences, but you also, in the introduction, you really set that up, I think, quite nicely in terms of the idea of a sort of paradox of liberalisation. So we tend to think of the rise of China as meaning a threat to the liberal global economic order, but here you've got an example of the rise of China leading to the breakdown of a managed market and the emergence of a liberal sort of pricing system, spot markets, and then financialisation, futures markets, and so on top of that. So can you sort of talk about those 2 concepts and the unintended consequences question in relation to the iron ore benchmarking collapse a bit more?
Thank you for that. So what got me interested in the iron ore case and the fall of the benchmark system, if we place ourselves back in the 2010s when I started researching this, really the China debate at the time was between sort of 2 positions. Some argued that China was going to integrate global economic institutions, and others argued that China was going to disrupt them. The debate has evolved, but what struck me about the fall of the benchmark system is that we had an institution that was not very liberal to start with. So in other words, it was a negotiated pricing regime, right? It was key producers. You had BHP, Rio, and Vale, the 3 key iron ore exporters. And you had, at the time before China emerged, the Japanese importers sitting down and agreeing on a price. So that doesn't strike me as a very sort of liberal setup. And then you have China emerging, taking the place of the Japanese negotiators. And this system falls apart, and you have the emergence of a spot market. And that is, in effect, the liberalization of a pricing regime. And this completely flipped on its head the China debate for me. And that's what got me really interested in that event. Because you had basically the emergence of China causing the liberalization of a market, which was very puzzling. But as I conducted my interviews and sought to understand what had happened, the case became more and more interesting because, in fact, the key Chinese stakeholders, the key market stakeholders in the iron ore case in China, so the leading industry association, the leading Chinese importers, Bao Steel at the time, others, they didn't want this to happen. So they had actually worked to make the system last. They had actually worked to lead the negotiations, to try to coordinate the Chinese domestic iron ore import market, and failed, essentially. And so what you had was the unintended consequence of Chinese behavior on a global economic institution. And why this is really important, and for all Chinese politics students, is that often when we don't go deep enough in understanding a story, and we only look at outcomes, and then try to derive intent, sometimes we miss the story. So if we were to have looked at only the outcome, the benchmark system fell, and presumed that this was a story of Chinese power, we would have assumed that this was the intent. But it wasn't. It was the opposite of the intent. And that's why unintended consequence is so important in all politics, but en l'occurrence, in this case, because you had the opposite outcome. And so that's about unintended consequences. And vulnerability creeps in there too, because the reason why the leading negotiators on the Chinese side were not able to maintain this benchmark system was because they were not able to control Chinese importers who went around the key leading negotiator to buy iron ore on what became a spot market, an emerging spot market. And so it was the fragmentation and the lack of coordination capacity on the part of the Chinese importers that led to this outcome. And this is a key area of vulnerability for China. And one of the very interesting recent developments on that front is that China created last year a new entity called the China Mineral Resources Group, large $3 billion group that is tasked with trying to coordinate iron ore importers and go back to a system of negotiated arrangements. And so China is still trying to get this coordination capacity on the rails, and it's still struggling to do so. And so there's a vulnerability aspect to this story that is key there too.
Cool. I think this might relate because you talk also elsewhere in the book about China having to think about China as a heterogeneous power. And I assume that's partly a foil that we tend to think of it as this massive monolith, people from outside in the West. And so but some of that might, all the specifics of these different markets and institutions and so on, but what do you mean by, you want to say a bit more about what you mean by the term heterogeneous power in relation to China?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, you're right. The concept of China as a heterogeneous power is a foil to the sort of unitary power or coherent and power that is often that China is often depicted as in the West. So in my book, China is a heterogeneous power, meaning its behavior varies across areas. In a couple of ways. First, I think it's very important to recognize that the domestic political economy of different markets in China varies a lot. So we have to look at what the situation is before presuming. So in the 4 cases I study in the book, some markets are much more fragmented than others. And this actually is the core of the explanation why I believe there was more disruption in the iron ore case than there was in the potash case, fertilizer case study. But I think that what interests perhaps, is of interest more broadly perhaps, is that as a result of this variation, this domestic variation in China, China's behavior varies also internationally. And so in different markets, the actors are different. The ministries involved pull and push differently. And despite overarching, despite power centralization, despite overarching directives and ambitions and intent, we see variation across issue areas, and in my case, even more narrowly, across markets. In the same issue area, in the same area of commodity markets, I observe very significantly, qualitatively significant variation across cases. I think this argument is being made by a series of very interesting scholarly publications over the past, I would say, 10 to 15 years. More routinely, the argument is made that China behaves differently in different issue areas. So say climate change versus, security versus global trade. China might have deployed various behavioral patterns that differ. So my book contributes to this scholarship, but within one single issue area. And in the political economy sense, we have to pay attention to the domestic determinants of China's behavior abroad to understand why its behavior varies across cases.
So I think I'll move to the last couple of questions, and one of them builds on that in the sense that and both these types of questions, I think, build out from the book to thinking more broadly rather than sort of on some of the detail in the book. But one of them, I think, is that I would think that most people, when they think about China's global economic dominance, they think about manufacturing. Right? They're thinking about cars, they're thinking about computers and components, they're thinking about that, and then and a decent number, for example, things like very visible trade conflicts arise out of those dynamics. So I wonder, and it's not that it's either commodities or it's manufacturing, but I'm wondering what the relationship between the sort of commodities markets and their relation. This is an extension of the heterogeneity, right? It's going to be heterogeneous in other ways as well, I assume, to its rise of manufacturing global dominance. How does that pick the commodities and the manufacturing bit fit together in the sort of Chinese political economy and its external relations?
Yeah, that's a really big question, but I think I can say a few things about that. That's okay. That's okay. But no, I think that what I draw from the book is that there are areas of resonance between the Chinese domestic economy and the global economy. And also that there continues to be, so the relationship between China's domestic political economy and the global political economy needs to be understood more deeply, and that there are remaining areas of deep interconnection and interdependence. And China remains, as much as we are, today in a paradigm of economic security and resilience and autonomy, China remains deeply vulnerable and connected to the global economy. In ways, in the commodities markets, it seems even more clear because we're talking about physical stuff that China needs to import from overseas. But I think that increasingly speaking, in the areas of the economy that matter, China remains deeply vulnerable and deeply connected to the global economy. And these patterns of resonance are really critical to understand and shouldn't be glossed over. And I think in the very frontier areas of the economy, we are facing now questions that are so deeply global in nature that it's difficult for me to conceptualize a full fragmentation of the global economy. Even if we think of AI, we think of all the frontier areas of economic activity today. And so I think of shifting patterns of interdependence in a world of rising economic security, but I struggle to think about profound decoupling or fragmentation in the way that some envision.
Fantastic. Yeah, no, I think it's a really important reminder to focus on commodities, because then all of this stuff, whether even like AI, you take AI, which seems completely immaterial, but it depends fundamentally on copper, right? You can't do AI without copper and a million other minerals as well to make the stuff that make all of those information systems work. And so that leads in a way to the final question, and which this is a selfish question in a way, but as a sort of climate political economist rather than a China political economist. But you wrote the book. I mean, you did a lot of the research in the book sort of a decade or so ago, and you chose those things. I mean, in energy transitions, copper is utterly central. Iron is also important. You make a lot of wind turbines out of iron, but it's probably not the other way central, right? That the iron is not, the wind turbines are not central to iron, even if iron is central to wind turbines. But there's a whole load of other minerals that where China has become utterly central to the flows and deployment, and then the manufacturing on the base, the processing and the manufacturing. So lithium, cobalt, there's about 40 odd of these rare earth metals and so on that are completely central to energy transitions to wean ourselves off fossil fuels. And and China is central to the manufacturing of all three of them, right? So it's batteries, wind turbines, and solar power, solar PV. Solar PV, I think, is currently about 65% of global production is in China. Wind turbines a bit lower. Wind turbines tend to be, there's a reason to locate the production a bit nearer where you're going to install them because they're so massive. But batteries is 80%, I think, or something, of electric vehicle and grid scale storage batteries for electrification. So they're really, so that's the, arguably one of the central global public policy type challenges, where many of the things that you talked about in the book are those processes in terms of China's relationship to global commodity markets is really central. So I wonder if you've thought about what you might have to say, and it's also stuff where it's becoming very, very contentious in terms of responses by the United States, Canada, Europe to try and onshore or nearshore or friendshore or whatever the term of the day is. That some of that manufacturing capacity, some of that control over those supply chains to Europe and North America. So have you got thoughts about what the arguments in the book have to say about some of the contemporary debates?
Yes, thank you for this question. Yes, the current way in which we think about minerals in 2024 is very different from the way we talked about minerals in the early 2010s. In many ways, the story I tell about China's vulnerability, perception of vulnerability by Chinese commodity market stakeholders, has been a feature of China's interaction with global commodity markets for decades. And so in other words, in so very many ways, China has felt vulnerable in the procurement of its necessary sources of energy, minerals, and so on, since reform and opening up and before. And this has been built into the way that the Chinese state and party state has regulated and thought about commodities procurement. In the West, I think that the West's vulnerability to minerals procurement has only dawned on policymakers over the past 5 years, right? And so there's a really interesting dialectic or resonance between perceptions of vulnerability between the Chinese and Western commodities producers and consumers that is developing. But China's had a head start in thinking about vulnerability, I would argue. And so some of the reflections that are occurring in the West about exposure to Chinese dominance in certain areas, like specifically more so in refining and processing of various minerals, is the result of the West not thinking about commodity markets in the same way as China has for the past 40, 50 years. And so the reasons why China has accumulated this dominance in the refining processing segments are very profound and have been building over a very long time. And I think that the various tools and policies that have been announced in the West over the past little while to diminish this vulnerability to Chinese dominance are probably, well-intended and necessary to some extent to, balance things out a little bit in terms of supply chain resilience, etc., but may not take us as far as some may think. So the dominance in Chinese, for example, refining processing of copper is over 40% of global activity. Canada has one copper processing plant. Some of my interviewees in the copper industry told me that even the knowledge, the capacity to build copper refining plants is not there in the West anymore. And basically, only in China can you build a refining plant, a copper refining plant, in a cost-effective way with the frontier technology today, basically. And so the effort needed is absolutely enormous. And I think that we have this question is much more profound and complex, I think, than the general discourse about diversification and de-risking would let us believe. And we have to ask questions, since you're asking about it from an environmental perspective. There are all sorts of trade-offs to de-risking, including on the climate front, that I think are not being articulated quite clearly enough to the average voter. And so basically, the way I think about it now, instead of thinking about trying to eliminate our vulnerabilities towards China on the critical minerals front, I would rather think about a way to balance each other's vulnerabilities. In other words, China remains vulnerable in so very many ways. We are vulnerable too in many ways. And why don't we try to think about balancing those instead of trying to eliminating those, which I think is not actually a feasible scenario.
Cool. Totally agreed. I was struck by two things. I think we're handing out to sort of audience in a question, but one thing you could think about historically, given we're sat in Manchester, about a kilometre south of where 70% of the world's cotton went in and out in the second half of the 19th century, and made Manchester specifically and Britain in general sort of globally dominant at that point of view as a manufacturing hub. How did they think of it? Did the warehouses, it's mostly warehouses in Manchester itself rather than cotton manufacturers, did they think of themselves as vulnerable in the way that you think, and how did they manage that?
Yeah.
So there's interesting historical knowledges, I think, across
Definitely.
different periods of trade. And the other thing is like the point you said about maybe China's got a 50-year head start about thinking about how to manage vulnerability. I've read a reasonable amount about the nickel industry in Indonesia, where Indonesia went down a sort of resource nationalist. We're going to ban the export of raw nickel, as they had done with timber about 20 years earlier. The EU's strategy is to sue them under the WTO. China's strategy is to say, okay, we'll help you build a refining plant.
Yes, yes.
And so there's an interesting sort of difference there, I think, which reflects what you're
Very much
saying.
in the ebb and flow of the dominant economic paradigm now as well, returning to a sort of industrial policy, economic nationalist paradigm, which the Chinese have been just a lot more used to thinking through than we have. So, yeah, the history resonates. Yeah.
So that's really interesting. I will pass back to the chair, who will invite you to other questions.
First, a round of applause. Thank you.